Everyone, welcome. My name is Joanna Ganning. I'm Associate Dean of the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs. On behalf of the college, our dean was unable to be here today, so on his behalf, I'd like to welcome you all to today's event, titled Communicating Scholarly Ideas in the Digital Age. We're so pleased today to welcome Michael McGandy. Michael is Senior Editor and Editorial Director of The Three Hills at Cornell University Press. Prior to arriving at Cornell University Press, he worked in commercial publishing at Rowman and Littlefield, W.W. Norton, and Macmillan Library Reference. He's the author of the essay Diverse Careers, The Waning of the Prestige Regime and the Rise of the Influence Economy in Academic Publishing, which appeared in The Reimagined PhD, published by Rutgers. I believe I can speak on behalf of everyone who attended his earlier session today with faculty and students and saying how informative and collegial it was, and we're just delighted to have you with us this afternoon. The Levin College of Urban Affairs at Cleveland State is dedicated to excellence in teaching, research, and service through engagement in the civic, cultural, and economic life in Greater Cleveland and the state of Ohio. In pursuing this mission, our faculty and students, as well as faculty and students across the university, as attested to by the diverse panel we have today, demonstrate excellence in research. However, scholarship has changed. The speed of data acquisition and processing has increased, adding pressure to publish more in less time, rendering data out of date more quickly, and creating many more ways to define and distribute knowledge. These changes have led to the rise of the public intellectual, or scholarship that is accessible and is not afraid to attract a wide following. What does all this mean for how contemporary society receives knowledge and how it becomes a part of public affairs? This forum does not pretend to cover these questions exhaustively, however much we might like to. Rather, we present slices of larger trends and implications. We thank our colleagues for participating in this conversation, and we're so pleased to have you with us again. Welcome. I will turn the floor over now to Rob Whitbread, Associate Professor and Director of the School of Communication here at CSU. Quite apropos of today's topic, and one of the many reasons I'm so pleased to introduce him to lead our panel. Dr. Whitbread's research focuses on the role of emergent social networks and organizations. Dr. Whitbread, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. It's my pleasure to moderate this particular forum. Before we get started, let me frame this conversation by inviting all of us to think back on the moments when we realized things had changed and probably weren't going to go back. So for me, there were three brief examples of this. The first was when you started to be requested to have data submitted as part of the publication process so others could then go in and confirm and process check that which you had done. And this in and of itself is generally considered a good thing, except for one particular moment. One of the quote unquote demigods of the field, who happened to be my mentor, who I will remain nameless, made a mistake. And then when the feedback came back saying he made a mistake, rather than admitting, oops, I did make a mistake, what can I learn from this? Fired off one of these legendary fire and brimstone emails that people are still talking about to this day. The second thing was when the advent of online journals came about, where you had a whole lot of suspicion about the quality of these things, justifiably so, right up until the Annenberg School of Communication at USC, what we call in my field Annenberg West, put out an online journal. And then suddenly in one fell swoop, these became respected forms of publication to be judged by the same metrics as the usual ones were. But it wasn't until that credibility factor came into being that mattered. And then the third for me, which Michael can probably speak to, was at one point I found myself in the interesting position where I had somehow misplaced the PDF of an article for which I was the author. So I tried to track down said PDF online and found myself in the weird position of being requested to pay $25 for access to said article that I was the author of in the first place, which of course said to me Did I find a backdoor around it? Sure. But that is when I began to realize, okay, the world has really changed in how some of these things are going to be done moving forward. So in addition to Michael, who was already introduced, our other panelist today is our Professor Cheatham Slankhard, who is the interim director of the School of Film and Media Arts at Cleveland State University. Her specialty area is documentary film, and she is focused on bringing visibility to underserved populations such as Congolese and Syrian refugee communities, as well as some of the areas struggling economically in the greater Cleveland area, such as Clark Fulton and Slavic Village. And then our third panelist is Professor Liz Layfeld, who is the Dean of the Mandel Honors College. I refuse to rattle off all those names on that thing as well. She is the former vice president of the teaching division of the American Historical Association and has written for Inside Higher Education, Times Higher Education, about current issues that are of importance to higher education administration. So the format we'll be following is each panelist will deliver his or her opening remarks, and they have promised me they will stay in time. We do have access to a mute button, by the way. Secondly, we will ask each panelist to speak more briefly to the issue of information and disinformation and how this is impacting their areas. Then we will open up the floor to conversation discussion. And I would ask you to make use of the chat room, send us your name, send us the gist of what your question comment is, and then we will be calling on you to give your question, comment, engage in discussion for the last part of the panel. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Professor Slankhard.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for the nice introduction. I will start with the very, very essentials, which is essentially technology, right? We're talking about digitization of content creation and distribution and how that has affected our areas. And as a filmmaker, I can tell you that filmmaking was not even possible at some point in time. You know, we only have a history of 115 years or so. 1895 is the very first film projection. Of course, there were efforts in place to capture motion pictures and share motion pictures, but really cinema as we know it only exists since 1895. And those were in the forms of 2-minute videos, or film clips that someone would like wind the cinematograph and show. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that what technology is available has always changed what types of films come, and the stories that we as filmmakers are able to tell depend on the technologies that are available to us. So to connect it to the digitization of content creation and distribution, you were really talking about the turn of the century, where around 2000, things are starting to become more and more common. Digital video creation and digitally sharing of this content is becoming more and more common. And this digitization of content creation and distribution has essentially revolutionized all aspects of the film industry, including documentary storytelling. And I will say, I tend to be an optimist, so I will say the impact of it has generally been positive, but of course there are areas to be cautioned and watchful of as well. Specifically in documentary, I think the new digital environment has created an opportunity for documentary films to find new audiences. I can really organize points under 3 main headings. One is abundance. Under abundance, so essentially there's this ease of access to means of media production, right? So nowadays everyone has a phone, but before that, 20 years ago, it just became easier and easier to have access to a video camera, so one could then create digital motion pictures that could capture stories, documentary stories or otherwise, and then could be edited. So access to easier and cheaper means of production leads to an abundance. Of course, production costs go down. I remember when I made my thesis film at the film school, I had to come up with, I got a grant for $5,000, which was great, and it didn't even cover the cost of my thesis film production, because we had to shoot on 16mm film. That is not the case anymore. Film production remains to be a very expensive field, but production costs certainly have come down, and also many options are available. mobile journalism. Think about that, the fact that you can capture and tell stories effectively through your phone, and also share very, very effectively with a large group of people. So this access and abundance essentially widened sort of audiences and also makers as well. So we're, again, like access and abundance, creating more and more media to be made and also to be consumed. So we add to that around, starting in 2000s, but really, really exploding in the 2010s, the streaming structure, which really changed the way films are distributed. Like it changed the way how the entire media industry operates. Increasing the number of channels available for content creation and distribution, and essentially leading to a great proliferation of content on the web, and accessible to wide audiences across the world. So that was access. So my second keyword is really new structures and forms are coming up through the impact of digitization. I started my opening remarks with, drawing our attention to the importance of technology. So at first we didn't have motion picture, then we had motion picture, but no sound. It was only black and white. Then we had sound, sync sound. Then we had color. Now we have virtual reality. Now we have content creation in the palm of our hands. Pretty soon it's going to be different. My watch will be able to shoot video and share video, et cetera. It already can actually share videos with me. So technology essentially leads to new structures and new forms. Just a few years ago, we were all interested in buying videos and what could be shared through that. Nowadays, we're interested in TikTok. So new platforms, new technology, new channels are essentially leading to different types of stories that would be told on those platforms. And my third point to make here is the democratization of content creation. Yes, access and abundance, these are very positive things, but that access and abundance essentially is leading to a large number of people having access and essentially creating a more democratized environment for content creation. So what does that mean? Communities that may not have had a voice in the media industry, it's a little bit easier, and with the focus on a little bit easier for them to have a voice present. Structures of power are still in place, and just because we have easier access and lower production costs and easier distribution does not negate those canonized structures and big structures in place. But I think that it is fair to say that easier access and lower cost in production has essentially democratized content creation a little bit more so. So generally, I would say this is digitization of content creation and distribution has a positive impact in my area, which is documentary storytelling. Marginalized communities have easier access to means of media production. Traditionally underserved communities might have a louder voice that's more present. And we also see video being used in ways that we really, really didn't see before for justice, social justice, and the criminal justice. If you think about George Floyd's case, the existence of that video, video being used as, in some cases, a weapon, in some cases, a shield. And nowadays, in our creation and consumption of these videos are such an essential part of our lives that we tend to take it for granted. But it's really recent history. I was in grad school when my cell phone was not able to capture video. You could witness a crime and you would not be able to record it. So in general, the technology is, making things better and easier, and also changing the way, the kinds of stories that are being told. And there are some things to be cautioned about, like in every good democracy, where we want a pluralism, we want, all kinds of voices to be present. But in that cacophony, sometimes it's easy to be lost and to in a decentralized content distribution system, then you don't know what to pay attention to, which brings us to the importance of visual literacy, digital literacy, media literacy, which really goes hand in hand with education, of course. So, who is more susceptible to manipulation? Who is more susceptible to being fooled, right? I think that these are some of the, I think I'll end my remarks here. I think we're going to revisit this sort of, misinformation and what to caution about the digitization of content a little bit later in our panel. But in general, very positive impact in terms of digitization of content in documentary film, with some areas to be cautioned for. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Professor Slankard. I will now turn the floor over to Professor Layfeld, who will speak to us about the impacts of all of this in her area, which is history.
Great, thank you, Rob, and thank you for the introduction earlier, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. As Rob noted, I'm going to come at today's topic from my perspective as a practicing historian and also someone who teaches history, and I think what Chidem was saying, I'll be picking up on in the second part too, sort of how do we prepare students to be savvy consumers of all of this content? But to get started from the perspective of history, there is absolutely no question that there's been an absolute explosion of digital and online resources for the study and consumption of history. And I would actually make that distinction between study and consumption. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, but I think they do embody different approaches and dispositions when we come to that digital content. And I'll say more in the second half about issues of accessibility and how to help students be discerning consumers. But for now, the content itself, and I'm going to base my remarks on a very specific example. There's a historian at Boston College named Heather Cox Richardson. She's primarily a historian of the Civil War period, so 19th century American historian. She catapulted herself into the limelight during the administration of President Trump with daily essays that she began posting on Facebook, so on a digital platform, in the run-up to Trump's impeachment trial. And her goal, and she was very clear about this, was to put current events in a historical context. I mean, basically the bread and butter of historians. And this Facebook content eventually migrated and became a newsletter on Substack, which is where a lot of folks do their newsletters these days. We don't blog anymore. Apparently we do newsletters on Substack. And she has generated $1 million in subscription revenue for Substack. So clearly what she is doing resonates. There is an audience for this work. Interestingly, one of the things I find most striking, though, about her work, please ignore the phone in the background, this is the perils of doing this from my office, is she has framed this discourse and titled it Letters from an American. She has deliberately deployed an old-fashioned form of communication, letters, and translated it to this digital platform, and invested an incredible amount of work in this. She writes approximately a 1,000 word essay every day. So in addition to the other things that she does as a professor of history at Boston College. So I would argue that with what she's doing on Substack, she has blown up the idea of what constitutes, and I'm going to put it in scare quotes, scholarship. For historians, up until this sort of digital moment we find ourselves in, for historians, scholarship traditionally defined and very field specifically defined has been things like the single authored monograph, the single authored peer-reviewed article. Historians do not tend to be collaborators, and I think that's something else that the digital turn, if you will, is beginning to change. So what do we do then with something like Heather Cox Richardson's Letters from an American, a a Substack newsletter that you have to subscribe to. There's issues of accessibility with the subscription, right? Because you have to pay to get access to all of the content. So I would be very curious, for example, to know how Richardson's institution, her home institution, Boston College, counts this work. Now, I think she's a full professor. She's not worried about tenure and promotion, but where do we put this kind of work in the sort of understanding of the professional work that historians or other practitioners of any discipline do? And so what's happened as a consequence is the academy is kind of playing catch up. And I'll just give one more example of how this is happening. So for someone like Heather Cox Richardson, the governing professional body is the American Historical Association. And in 2015, the American Historical Association, the Executive Council approved, and this is the title of the document, Guidelines for the Professional Evaluation of Digital Scholarship by Historians. So what the AHA is trying to do is equip both the practitioners of this digital scholarship and their peers who might be evaluating that work as part of a promotion and tenure decision or as part of a workload decision or something like that. The AHA has tried to equip both sides, the practitioners and the evaluators, with some possible tools for how we assess this work. And it means approaching the discipline in different ways. Two examples. One would be you have to sort of look at it in its native digital medium. You can't sort of print out a digital project for your colleagues to read. They have to sort of encounter this work in its native digital medium. And you have to take into account various other ways in which this work is shaped. Digital projects tend to be, at least the kinds of work done in history, they're always sort of unfinished, right? There's never kind of an endpoint like there might be with a monograph or a peer-reviewed article. It's always kind of a work in progress. And also, as I hinted at before, there's a lot more collaboration that goes into this kind of digital scholarship, and history as a discipline needs to sort of have a reckoning with that. So my larger point would be that all of this digital work, at least in my field, is really challenging the notion of what constitutes scholarship and how we ought to evaluate it.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Layfeld. Now we will turn it over to Michael, who will speak to us from the direction of publishing, as well as some other ideas he'd like to share. Michael?
Thank you, Rob. And yeah, if the AHA is playing catch up, I don't know where publishers are. We're in the rear guard of the catch up committee. Thank you, Rob, for talking about these pivotal moments where we recognize things change. And I would make a case in a different form that where it all changes when the card catalog got shut down. But we're not going to go that far back. I think about the time when we began to close up shop for the pandemic, and think about what the digital media and digital technologies, digital networks have meant is that we, like I'm sure pretty much everyone else in this Zoom room, changed very easily over to our non-embodied virtual work environment, being at a press where people would visit the press and they would come and they would still look for the printing press, right? So, I mean, people, there's a sense of what we do that is very much tied to the materiality of the book that lingers and lingers and lingers. And for an institution that is conservative, and I'm not talking about the Cornell Press in particular, but publishers more generally, we, as a matter of workflow, as a matter of sharing materials, as a matter of being able to process things in a paperless environment, being able to transfer files, all of these things happen completely smoothly and suggest that we have changed in those regards as quickly and as adeptly as any other body of kind of white collar, information workers. Paired with that is a deep conservatism in our processes, and that is grounded in peer review. Nothing about how I evaluate my projects except they market to some degree, but nothing about the substance of the projects I evaluate has changed in any way, shape, or form. Peer review is still peer review. Excellence changes over time, but the standard and the mechanisms to accredit excellence have not changed. And some of that has to do with, making long form narrative arguments, and that is a less nimble sort of thing. I think a lot of it also has to do with the fact that we are right smack in between. Use Cheatham's words, I'm talking about creators and makers and accrediting bodies. The makers and the creators and the thinkers are more creative and they're more fluid and they're doing it towards something. The bodies that accredit are the slowest moving things in the world. And we can't pay our bills unless we're satisfying the accrediting bodies. So many people have come to me and said, when are you guys going to change? When are you going to crowdsource peer review? Which I have lots of problems with. But one of the main problems is that we can't exist if tenure and promotion committees don't accept our judgments of excellence, because then we're out of the game and no one's going to publish with us, because 49% press in this case would not be a viable body to develop ideas and make them frankly saleable, right, in the academy. So we are very flexible, and we're as flexible as any white collar group, and yet we're also tied into a very conservative process that has lagged behind everything. And I don't think, as probably will become very clear in a moment, I don't think lagging is always a bad thing. But there's no doubt that there's this divide. To start, I just want to know 4 areas where there's been change in my business and anticipating the future, the conversation to come. One, and I want to note what's sort of changing and what the price is, right? Because I think also Cheatham has noted how there's a price to be paid, right? They're good things and they come with prices. So clearly, open access is a new area, not new, but it's new in the humanities, let's say. And my work, very much like Liz's, is principally in history. And that is opening up many things. It's providing lots of opportunities. But I think at this moment, there's also a lot of economic realities about access. And there's a big risk that open access is only going to exacerbate inequities and not solve them. But we are changing in that regard. The other way we're changing, and this is a much longer running change, is funneling our work into aggregators like Muse and JSTOR. We're opening up new revenue streams. We are seeing significant amounts of income, but it's also drying up revenue streams. And what makes it challenging, particularly for institutions like ourselves, is that we've always been used to doing cost accounting, title by title, book by book. What kind of books are making money, what kind of books aren't. The monies we see, the income that we see from a JSTOR and a Muse is disaggregated. It's just money. It's great to have. It balances the books, but we don't know well anymore which titles are doing well, which titles are not doing well. That's not the sole standard, obviously, for what we do. There are lots of other matters, again, about accreditation, about excellence, journal reviews, contributing to discourse. But we now have very fuzzy metrics, very fuzzy financial data. And that makes it hard to plan, makes it very hard to make decisions. Third area I would note, and Liz touched, not even just touched, but I think gave it a very incisive analysis and very short summary, digital humanities. Basically publishing non-books, right? How do we become the publisher of things that aren't books? And that is exciting and great. Problems are, it costs a ton of money. And it requires a lot of prestige. And the case of Heather Cox Christian is great because her startup costs were very minimal given the technology she was using, but her professional startup costs, only she or only a certain class of scholars could pay that. To invest that much time and energy to create that and not do, she had to have not done other things because she's human. Other people could not have not done those things and gotten away with it. So she had the capital, not in dollars and cents, but she had it in terms of a professional standing. And as Liz noted, hats off to AHA for coming up with some guidelines. No one knows how to apply them. No hiring and tenure and promotion committee knows what to do with the digital humanities yet. And of course, the definition of digital humanities itself is quite amorphous as well. So that's a third area. And the fourth area, and the example of Heather Cox Richardson fits in here as well, is diversity of media. Right? The book is one thing. And then there are podcasts, and then there are no longer blogs, it's Substack, or it's letters, or it's, but there are videos, there's TikTok. There are many things that one could be doing to create, to refine, to speak, to argue. And they all have a place along the spectrum of ways of communicating your ideas. And as an editor, I want my authors to be out there in a variety, maybe not all, I'm not crazy, but a variety of media, pushing their ideas. Not all these things are monetizable, but it's all good to contributing to a conversation, which is the best I can hope for my books. But which media are accredited? Which media are going to pay the bills? Which media are going to frankly, which ones can you choose that will frankly allow you to sleep 8 hours and not drive yourself into the ground? When I encourage my authors to write a lot, they will often come back to me and say, I would love to, but I can tell you that I'm dead tired and I have to take care of these things, and I just can't be the kind of author scholar you want me to be. And of course, then I have to backtrack and say, I never wanted to drive them into the ground. But the diversity of media creates a diversity of possibilities, but it also creates an indefinite realm of exertion, most of it which is not rewarded in any material way. The Cox Richardson case is exemplary in many ways, but is also exemplary in its uniqueness, and how many people have labored in Substack and continue to labor in Substack. So those are 4 areas where there's lots of change. It's making a difference in terms of how I do my work. And in each case, I have some anxieties about what it does to authors, what it does to scholarship, and what it means for the fundamental institutions that we are part of that have their problems, no doubt about it, but also have some good things in them that need to be conserved. And I'm not sure that we collectively are seeing all of that as clearly as we could.
Great, thank you. Excuse me. Before we move forward, Aaron, I believe, had a comment, and this was a recurring theme throughout all 3 of the panelists' presentation, which is speaking to the issue of quality control, what counts, what doesn't count. And I think it's worth, given that we do have a relatively small group here, if Aaron doesn't mind, if Aaron wants to mute himself, of course, person can speak for themselves. But if I can sort of reframe this a little bit, and then Aaron can follow up if this isn't what you're getting at, is what advice would you give to someone who has developed these new skills, who is exploring these new areas, who is facing judgment calls from, for lack of a better term, the establishment, who ultimately are in the position of, to some extent, decision-making authority? Is that, Aaron, is that fair?
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. It happened with my graduate advisor, who kind of encouraged me to just stop doing what I was doing and just focus strictly on my dissertation and research.
Mm-hmm. What would the panelists advise Aaron on this one?
If they're not already aware of it, I would put this AHA statement in front of them. The reason the AHA came up with it, well, lots of reasons, but one of them was to be able to sort of give the imprimatur of the professional association for historians, and to say, no, we do recognize that this work is legitimate, that it is scholarly. It's a fairly extensive document. It provides some advice for how departments can position themselves to evaluate this work. It also provides some advice for how the practitioners ought to position themselves in ways to help that establishment better understand what the work is. Because I think a lot of this is, some of it is old guard, and people just sort of pushing back because it's not what they did to get tenure and that sort of thing. But I do also think that some of it is just a lack of understanding what really goes into a lot of this digital humanities work. And Aaron, also as a side note, my PhD in history is from IU, so go.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. The second thing we're going to sort of dovetail into is with a panel such as this, we got some summaries and some discussion of how the changes which have taken place and continue to take place have had a demonstrable material impact in 3 different, somewhat distinct areas. The next thing we'd like to sort of tail into is one of the contemporary topics of the day, which is this whole issue of information disinformation and how this is having an impact in these given areas. So we'll just go ahead and go in the order in which we did before. So Cheatham?
Sure, yeah, misinformation, disinformation, and the proliferating of this misinformation, right? So I don't know, I always go back to the beginning of our forum, and I will say that's not new. You know, there was once there was film, there was propaganda film. You know, once there was printed material, there was also printed material that you know, spread misinformation. I think the issue that we run into now is that there is so much content. It's this abundance that really sort of magnifies the issue and the danger of the spread of misinformation and disinformation. In my case, as a documentary filmmaker, you know, who gets to call themselves a filmmaker? And what is a film? Is the recording of a crime a film? Not really. It's more data. It's more a document, but it can be contextualized in the form of a film. You know, is Plandemic a documentary? In a way, it's not that different than Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl, which of course is one of the most famous propaganda documentaries from the Nazi era. So history does repeat itself in the form, at least in the world of cinema. It just sometimes the forms and the channels through which it does shift. And in our age, I think the magnification of it is different. It's so much more magnified because there is so much more media. People spend so much more time consuming it. I think the danger is greater. And another thing is, this is again my wishful thinking here. I think that we are concerned, rightfully concerned, with the dangers that comes with misinformation. But I would like to think that we are more aware of it than we would have been otherwise. I think that I would like to suggest that that spread of misinformation would have been there at other times as well. It's just that we wouldn't necessarily know. The general public would not be quite as informed of that. So I don't have any data to support this, but this is just, again, scaling things to, you know, an abundance of media and imagining what it might have been like if the numbers were smaller. But of course, we can't really talk about misinformation, disinformation, documentary, pseudo-documentary, and not really mention how important it is to be visually literate, media literate. Of course, most schools incorporate this into K-12 education. And we would like to think that we are, I think, as a society, making headway to address some of the issues that we are suffering from. And I'm sure that we all have relatives, older relatives, where you have to remind them, like, not everything that you read on the internet is true, Mom. Don't believe that. So we've all had these experiences as well. So I think that the point there that I'm trying to make is that I think there is something generational that we have to be aware of. And there is something about the education system that, you know, I believe that these are issues that are being addressed. To what efficacy in terms of all around the country, I couldn't speak to that. But I think that there is an awareness of the importance of visual literacy and media literacy, and I think that there are efforts in place, which of course we must support as educators, as academics, and perpetuate this level of, you know, inquisition, creative thinking, and hopefully a higher level of understanding of the media that we consume.
Excellent. Thank you, Cheatham. Liz?
Yeah, so I'm going to try and find the link. I had it before, and I'll stick it in the chat when I find it. But you know, I really sort of came at this question from the perspective of, you know, what would I do in my classroom when I'm working with students and having them, you know, they're doing a research project and they come across a digital source of some sort, a website or something like that, and trying to help them evaluate that work. And I came across a really great tool. I'm going to forget where it's from. I think it's out of CUNY. And so it asks students to sort of walk through a series of questions. And actually, as I was preparing and looking at these questions, I'm like, wow, these would actually be good questions for reviewers and evaluators of this work to ask themselves as well. This isn't just about our students, to sort of get at part of the question that Ed has put in the chat. We would be well served as colleagues to ask ourselves these questions too. So it's 5 questions. I'm just going to read them because I think it sort of gives us a sense of what we might ask students to do. Now, this is with history in mind again. So first question, what kinds of historical sources does the project use? Does the design or information architecture make a scholarly argument? And I really like this notion of the design or information architecture because it really asks the students to engage with the platform, with the way the information is being presented, and then asks them, okay, given how the project is set up, is it actually making an argument, or is it just kind of shoving a lot of information out onto the internet? Third question, what kinds of research questions could be answered by this project? So, you know, what is the inherent utility of this project? What might we learn from this project? Would it help us answer particular questions? And we might arrive at some sense of the value of that project from that question. Who is the project's intended audience? Question historians always ask about their sources. You know, who is this for? And then finally, what qualifications do the creators have? Who are the people behind the project? You know, what do they sort of bring to the table? And so again, I'll just say that, yes, these are great questions for students to ask about sources, but I think we as established colleagues, scholars, peers, et cetera, would do well to ask ourselves these questions as well when we're sort of standing in judgment of somebody's digital work.
Excellent, thank you. Michael?
There has been, I think that Jim's right, I mean, thinking about this as a continuum, as all this being a possibility of any technology is apropos. We have, within the university press world and scholarly publishing more generally, but university press world, I mean, we are, when misinformation and disinformation became a buzz 4 or so years ago, been there before, but when it became more prominent, we certainly collectively stepped forward through our main organization, the Association of University Presses, and, you know, we are the bulwark against disinformation. And how do we do that? Well, we have peer review again. We have journals that check things out. It's not to say everything's right, but we have mechanisms, institutions in place in which there can be reasonable discussion about the facts, understanding that facts are not fixed exactly, but they're also not what you want to say. They're somewhere in between. And we've got structures to make this happen. And we've went forward into the world, and no one listened to us, but we claimed ourselves to be the champions of reliable information. And around in midst of that, I think Amy Wolf's takedown for her book Outrage, it happened, you know, about 3 or 4 years ago when she was on BBC, and she just was wrong about some facts, and someone asked her a question on BBC radio or TV, and then she was taken down for her book entirely, and it all fell apart in about 10 minutes. And we all looked at it and said that would have not happened if there was peer review. So we have always, but with more intentionality and with better PR, been promoting ourselves as precisely one of the key institutions that can part of a larger argument against mis and disinformation. So not much has changed. And I think, again, that's a little bit of our conservative nature. The one thing that did come to my mind when I was thinking about this question is that the mis and dis, and more, I think, the miss than the dis of information that concern me is actually regarding digitization itself and digital technologies. I think that, and this is implicit in lots of things I was saying before, there is clearly a digital ideology that calls some things technology and some things not technology. Books are a technology. So are handhelds a technology. Every technology, in my Heideggerian moment, makes some things possible and makes other things impossible, meaning everything you pay a price for it. The question is, do you know what the price is and are you willing to pay it? And are you foisting that price on someone else? Or is this to some degree a consensual understanding of who we want to become and what we're willing to take on and what we're willing to let go of? I think that a lot of and I see this mostly in the OA community, it's new, it's the future, it's better, and it has to be, it is ordained by the very nature of its sort of a technological determinism. And that one strikes me as historically false, but also it strikes me as problematic because it occludes a lot of the things that are happening within technology itself that are within digital technologies themselves that are counter, I think, to what some of the proponents, and I'm speaking in a way that no historian would accept because I'm talking about theys and thems and people, unidentified people saying things. But certainly, there's the idea of free information, and we know that open access is not free information. We know that it is freer in some ways, and it is not freer in other ways. It's freer for some people and not for other people. We also know that books are not cheap, let alone costless, if they're not printed. Everything that goes into making a book is my salary, really. It's not the paper, the printing paper and binding. We know that an all e-world is not a carbon-free world. We know that digitization is not solving all these problems. It is shifting them, or issues, let's call them issues, shifting these issues. And just thinking about the comment in the margin before, I'm just going up here. Thank you from Edward. I mean, thinking about where the value of community engagement and community oriented scholarship is, and how do we frame that, and how do we make that visible to administrators, and then valorize the work and then valorize the people who are doing it. I think the movement towards open access, which I think is an elite movement and not a popular movement, makes that increasingly hard, because the strange thing is, while all the world has a handheld, most people do not find their information on university servers. They find it in other ways. And a printed book, even if it costs $22, $22.95, is actually still more available and more democratic than a free downloadable file on a university server. Because I think some people freak out if they get to a university website. They are not the most easy one to negotiate, even if you are familiar with them. And they are still kind of couched as elite exclusive data. If you know how to negotiate this environment, it's available. So there's a jargon of open and free and community, and then there's a technology, which actually I think runs counter to it in many respects. So I think the miss and dis, and again, more the miss than the dis, actually for me, it's around the technologies themselves.
Yeah, thank you. The only other thing that I would add to this is that right now, this, whatever you want to call it, is targeted, it's intentional, and in some cases, it's profit driven. And we're in the School of Communication, we're teaching some of these techniques for better or for worse, and some of them are being appropriated where, let's face it, some of our colleagues in the academy have been not only challenged real time by some of the things that they've put out there, they've come under threat as well with these things. So I'm just throwing that out there, where there is sort of a granular angle to this that sometimes doesn't want to be necessarily mentioned all that much. I'm going to take the lead from some of the comments in the chat room at this point. So I would ask Ed. Ed, do you have audio?
I have audio. Hello.
Okay, somebody hit the mute button quick. So I would ask Ed, we sat on these peer review committees before, and we've had these types of conversations about this thing. How would we approach this question you raise about the podcast? What would we do with somebody who did come up for tenure promotion review, who was articulating? How would we manage that? I'm not just asking Ed, I'm asking everybody, everybody participating, what their thoughts are and what we would do with this.
I mean, Rob, what I would expect to happen is what happens on a lot of things is old guard versus new guard, is we have some crusty professors who absolutely would not look at this and this is absolutely not something that we would count. I don't care how quote unquote popular it is, we're looking at scholarship only, and we would have younger faculty and who would look at this as saying, this is something that's worthwhile, that this person is, doing something interesting and bringing a critical perspective on things, and that this needs to be thought about in a new way. So I think we have this big divide. And I appreciate what Michael said about, the slowness of associations and accreditation organizations to accept this. And I think, it's a difficult thing because, the world is changing around us, and there are people here who want to do new things. Cheatham comes up with new things for her documentaries, and people don't necessarily want that to have that. So I don't know. I'm curious to know what others on the panel think. That's why I sort of raised it.
I'd like to say, I think the peer review is peer review in digital humanities, film, and even podcasts, I think. When we make a documentary, the peer reviews that, how is that shown? Do you get distribution? Do you have film festival representation? And then what we look at is the caliber of the venue that includes that project. So, how long has this festival been there? How many films? Who are the other filmmakers whose films have been included? How significant? What is the attendance, the impact of it? So I think the forms that we measure the impact of the work and the status of the work are comparable to peer review process in publications as well. With podcasts, it's a little bit harder. I think podcasts almost resemble design in that way. Like how do you really evaluate graphic design for graphic design faculty? Because it is a practice. So there's, of course, then, in design faculty, what they look at is, have you won awards? Has this design been published? Who has reviewed this in what capacity? And, the peer review sort of comes in like that. And with podcasts, I think there are possibly mechanisms that could fill that in. It could be reviews of the podcast or the listenership, has it been quoted in other things? I think there are ways of establishing them. And thankfully, I don't have to be the person to decide any of those things. But there are bodies in place, for us, University Film and Video Association, which is a national conference that has produced guide documents, and Dr. Liefeld shared, in her field that there are certain things. And I think that this is, so all I'm saying is that I think that this is something that we will have to keep revising as technologies change and as scholarship change. I think Austin Cummings in the chat, there was another comment about digital scholarship. And I relate to the unease of this question. I think that it's and sometimes I think it is possible to sort of get lost in the cracks a little bit of our established institutions. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, real quick, Austin, can you summarize? I know we're running right up against our allotted hour, so if everyone can indulge for like one more minute. I'm not comfortable summarizing what Austin put in the chat. I'd rather he spoke for himself on that one.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks for doing this and sitting on this panel as well. I guess like I am a former PhD student, and in thinking and in evaluating like going forward with my PhD and finishing it, a big concern of mine was the amount of unpaid labor that was expected, and what you're talking, and specifically, the burnout that's connected to it. Having several publications that are peer reviewed, and having and already, like, while I was a PhD student, made, like, that was an expectation for even entering the institution, and entering, and even having the ability to sit as, even get, recognized in a tenure track position, let alone, because you guys have talked about, how our tenure track, or how are people going to be evaluated in the tenure track process. There are a lot of people that are, trying to enter into the field of academia and working in a collegiate setting. However, the changing dynamic of what's considered appropriate labor, and the financialization of scholarship itself is one that I'm, like, kind of concerned about, and actually pushed me out of continuing that. And I only do independent scholarship now, because of those sort of demands for clicks and having to retweet everything. And even as an independent researcher, I have had scholarship recognized in some pretty prestigious areas and ways. But I think what I'm curious about is how do you feel like the peer review process, the digitalization of scholarship, the increased democratization of who is a researcher and what constitutes research, and the changing dynamics of funding for post-secondary institutions, how that is all filtering into this process of talking about this, because the labor market for PhDs is really difficult. I think that's, so I'm curious how you guys are, thinking about that for people who are, just like one of the other contributors today was, he's finishing up his PhD and is looking at, well, what's going to happen to me? How do what counts? Because I have 7 peer-reviewed publications and I still can't get a job, So I'm curious what and you're thinking about this, and even as a publisher, like, how you even start to evaluate somebody who is an established independent researcher, but doesn't have an institution it's connected to as well.
I could,
Michael?
talking about public. Two thoughts. One is about, and I faced the question, or I have faced that question in the past, and I've decided it's no longer a question, regarding people's institutional status. In that has two dimensions. One is that the descent and the descent of sales across the board for all of my first books has been so rapid and deep that it no longer matters if you are on a tenure track post at Penn State or you're an independent scholar in Tuscaloosa. It really just does not matter. Your sales are going to be terrible one way or another. So the bite, we always used to say that the person who is playing the tenure track game is developing networks, and there's a whole sort of potlatch thing where, I'll buy your book, I'll teach your book, as professional development. And that's just not happening anymore. I do think a lot of that's happening on JSTOR, or rather on Muse, but I can't tell you which books are being benefited by that or not. All I can tell you is that the dollars are there. And I think there are an increasing number of editors who are just saying, I don't care. I just don't care. And some of that is principle, and some of it is, we're kind of you anyhow, right? We washed out of other careers and we're doing this thing, so we're with you in that regard. So I think there's less elitism operating now for vetting book projects in terms of where people are sitting when they pitch them to us. The other thought I had, and this is an N of 1, but all the same, there's academic freedom, there's tenure, there are these more traditional institutions that have a lot of really important values baked into them. They also have, our conversation, have a lot of problems baked into them. I have a couple authors at Arizona State, contracts, all contracts. And it sounds chilling and it sounds neoliberal in all of the bad senses of that term. I also find the administrators there are willing to pay for what they think is valuable, and they are putting down chunks of change for OA books. They're also putting down chunks of change to buy out leaves for my authors because they're saying it's valuable. And I'm not even going to go to the high-minded stuff. We like you and we want to support you and we have money in there. And to use a term that unfortunately has been ruined for us for at least another decade, it is very transactional and it's not very principled, but it's direct and no one's lying. And I think there's a lot of lying that goes on in our institutions, and people hide behind principles that they actually don't care about, but they do give them an opportunity to say no to people. And Arizona State is doing right by some people. I'm sure they're doing wrong by a lot of other people too. But I'm seeing some oddly right and surprising calls.
Yep. Excellent. We're pretty much over time right now. Before we take off, I just want to recognize the person who organized this, Kara Keating-Copeland, who had the displeasure of trying to herd the cats of organizing us, mostly myself, in putting this thing together. I would also like everyone to take a quick look at the chat room where the next presentation or forum is advertised. And with that, would anyone like to say any final words, or are we set? Thanks to all our panelists. And the one thing I will say, Austin, is when you speak about the unpaid labor and things of that nature, you're right. The other thing about it is one thing you could look at is there are some think tanks out there, there are some funding agencies out there which are offering different sorts of grants and things of that nature to support independent scholarship of that nature. Depending on the nature of the grant funding agency, there may be strings attached and things like that to wade through, but that is another potential forum that you could explore looking at those things. So with that, thank you all for attending, and hopefully we'll see you all at the next one.